Winter in 15th century Europe. Without refrigeration, the daily reality at the dinner table involved choking down thick slabs of pale meat that were heavily salted, completely tasteless, or actively rotting. To preserve that meat and make it edible, they desperately needed exotic spices: black pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, and cloves. But those spices didn't grow anywhere in Europe. They had to be imported from a distant, almost mythical place the world called India. Getting those spices over land was a financial nightmare. Arab merchants held a strict monopoly on the desert routes, charging astronomical markups. And sitting right in the middle was the Ottoman Empire, acting as a massive, impenetrable wall, blocking European access. That left the ocean as the only alternative. This was a terrifying prospect at a time when sailors largely believed the Earth was flat, and that sailing too far out meant dropping into an infinite abyss or being swallowed by sea monsters. For the kings of Portugal and Spain, finding a direct sea route had become the only viable way to break the Ottoman monopoly and secure their kingdom's wealth. Previous attempts to break through the water had failed. A decade earlier, the explorer Bartolomeu Dias sailed down the African coast, only to be terrified and beaten back at a jagged point he named the Cape of Storms. To conquer that horrifying distance, Portugal's King Manuel I realized he couldn't hire a normal sailor. He needed someone who lacked a basic human sense of fear. He summoned Vasco da Gama. Da Gama was deeply stubborn, unyielding, and eccentric. He looked the king in the eye and swore he would tear down the ocean's doors to bring back the wealth of the East, or he would die trying. By choosing da Gama, King Manuel staked the Portuguese crown's future on a man who prioritized the mission over his own survival. On July 8, 1497, da Gama's fleet departed Lisbon. The thousands gathered weren't cheering. They were weeping, beating their chests in mourning, treating the departure like a funeral procession for a cruise sailing straight to their graves. The open Atlantic quickly validated their terror. High winds shredded the ship's sails into rags, and waves the size of 10-story buildings repeatedly crashed down on the fragile wooden hulls. Then an invisible killer attacked. Deprived of fresh food and vital nutrients for months, the crew developed severe scurvy. Their gums bled, their teeth rotted and fell into their hands, and the lower decks turned into a horrific floating morgue. Broken by the disease and the storms, the surviving sailors mutinied. They fell to their knees, begging da Gama to abandon the spices, turn the ships around, and let them go home alive. Da Gama drew his sword. He gathered every navigational instrument on board and hurled them into the ocean. He told his crew there was no turning back. If anyone mentioned returning, the ocean wouldn't kill them, because he would slaughter them himself first. By intentionally destroying their only way home, da Gama pushed his fleet through the deadly Cape of Storms using sheer, inescapable terror. Miraculously, they survived the Cape. But as they entered the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese were completely lost. The wind patterns, the ocean currents, and even the stars in the sky were completely unfamiliar. Da Gama realized his crude European tools were useless here. On the East African coast at Malindi, he hired a local Indian navigator to guide them the rest of the way. This local navigator possessed an incredibly precise knowledge of the stars and the complex monsoon winds. He proved that the indigenous sailors were the true masters of these seas. On the morning of May 20th, 1498, the stench of sickness below the decks was suddenly replaced by an intense, sweet breeze. It was the distinct aroma of sandalwood, cardamom, and black pepper. They had reached land. The most famous navigational discovery in European history was achieved by following the guidance of sailors who had already been crossing these waters for generations. Stepping ashore in Calicut, da Gama's expectations of a primitive backwater were immediately shattered. He walked into a wildly wealthy global metropolis that was already the center of world trade. The cultural gap was embarrassing. The local ruler, King Zamorin, sat on a throne draped in massive gold chains and diamonds. Da Gama, unwashed and wearing ragged clothes, presented his diplomatic gifts: some cheap wool hats, brass pots, and a jar of honey. The king's courtiers openly laughed at him. Despite the pathetic offering, Indian hospitality prevailed. The king peacefully welcomed the foreigners and permitted them to buy spices, allowing da Gama to pack his broken ships to the absolute limit. This chart shows the financial reality of da Gama's return to Lisbon. Even after absorbing the massive costs of dead crews, ruined ships, and sailor wages, the sale of that single spice cargo generated a pure profit 64 times higher than the initial investment. These figures sent a shockwave through the royal courts of Europe. The potential for such a massive return meant the risks of long-distance war and territorial invasion were now seen by monarchs as sound business investments. Word of the profits spread across Europe overnight. Desperate to capture the wealth of the East, the Dutch, the French, and eventually the British rapidly swarmed the new sea route. The European powers quickly betrayed the hospitality they were shown in Calicut. They transformed peaceful coastal trading posts into armed fortresses, aiming cannons at the ports to enforce their will over the waters. What followed were centuries of brutal colonization. The colonial companies pitted local Indian states against each other, dismantled local industries, and systematically drained the wealth of the land to pave European capitals. But India endured. The centuries of exploitation sparked an unyielding resistance that climaxed on August 15, 1947, when millions of citizens finally shattered the colonial chains and reclaimed their sovereignty. The voyage for spice opened a door to centuries of occupation, but as the events of 1947 proved, the desire for self-determination eventually outlasted the foreign companies that came for the trade.